Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. I've set out to uncover amazing and insightful stories by interviewing people from all different backgrounds and perspectives. But unlike other interview shows, only this show aims to also teach you what it means to listen more than you speak so that you can become a more thoughtful and informed person. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and that listening to someone speak their truth and their experience is one of the most human things we can do. More than ever, there is a general lack of willingness to go deep to understand why people think, act, and believe like they do, especially when there are differences of opinions. And my goal is to counter this by asking my guests questions and then getting out of their way. By seeding the narrative and simply asking the next question, I hope the stories that deserve to be told come to life so that we all might better empathize with the people, the human beings around us. Today on the show, I welcome Dr. Liane Davey, or just Liane, as she preferred me to call her. She's known as the Teamwork Doctor. She's a seasoned public speaker and author, including the writer of the book, The Good Fight: Use Productive Conflict to Get Your Team and Organization Back on Track. And this is what we talk about in this episode. Productive conflict. How do we do it? How do we get beneath the facts of an argument to the heart of the matter? I came across her when I found this quote, I believe it was on LinkedIn: "The next time you're tempted to dispute someone's facts, save your breath. Instead, get beneath the facts by asking questions to expose what they feel and what they believe. Facts won't solve fights." And as a guy who likes to ask questions, that spoke to me. Get beneath the facts by asking questions. That's where healthy conflict comes into play. And we talk about all different scenarios of conflict. Conflict at work. We talk about just here in the United States, Thanksgiving is coming up. What's conflict there going to look like if our families are getting together? And even getting together as a family presents conflict these days with all the restrictions and regulations that are in place. And for you parents, there's even a little bit of advice on how to raise a healthy conflict nature within our children. And it starts with the artwork that they bring home from school. Really interesting stuff there. This is one of the most enjoyable interviews I've ever done. I laughed a ton. Liane was so gracious and so willing to dive deep with me on the topic of conflict. And it was just a fantastic conversation, one that I know you all will enjoy. So many thanks to Liane. Here it is, my conversation with Dr. Liane Davey. Can you tell me about the most dysfunctional or most conflict avoidant team that you've walked into?
Oh, that's a great question. I need to have a team come to mind. It's funny, no specific team comes to mind because conflict aversion is just so common. One of the interesting things is they're more likely to be led by men. So we have this interesting stereotype that, men are the ones who like conflict and embrace conflict and can use conflict to wield power over others. And I find that it's very common that a team that's really struggling with conflict aversion has a conflict avoidant male at the helm. So that's one thing I can tell you. Very common to find them in cultures where there's something about the organizational culture that has an aspect of being nice as part of the culture. So organizations with strong customer orientation, not-for-profit organizations. Not-for-profit organizations can be really challenging because the people who are attracted to their mandate are often people who are very attracted to kind of harmonious intergroup reactions. So, those are the kinds of organizations, but it's hard to say that one team stands out more than others.
Well, good. We don't have to call anybody out here today.
Yeah, I do often when I'll write a blog about a session I've just had, and of course I always anonymize it, but then I'll often get a message later like, that was about us. And it's funny because, often it's the team where, yes, it really was about them, but often it's somebody else that just has a guilty conscience. You're like, actually, it wasn't, but but that's a good sign that you should probably address the issue.
Yeah, there's something going on there you may want to look into. Going back to your point about conflict avoidant teams tend to be led by conflict avoidant men, and that kind of is, where does that dichotomy come in? Because we see, like you said, so many men being the challenging type, and then it seems to go against what appears to be a stereotype then. Where do you see that dichotomy play out?
Yeah, you get, it's a really bimodal distribution in men. So you do get the sort of conflict avoidant types where they let issues fester, where people are so desperate for them to lead and give them direction. And you tend to see all the eyeballs go to them in a meeting, like all the eye contact goes to the leader, essentially saying, please lead us. And they don't. Then we have the other end of the distribution, which is people who wield power to keep others at a distance, to intimidate them. They use conflict as a stand-in because they're not effective at coaching or performance management. So they just use fear. So we get kind of those two different modes. You certainly see women in both of those modes as well. But, for the vast majority of women I see who've made it to this level, one of the reasons they've made it and broken through the glass ceiling is that they are quite effective at managing conflict. They've had to be. So that's kind of an interesting effect that I've seen. The more and more and more women we get into higher levels of leadership, it'll start to wash out. We'll go back to seeing just sort of the natural human individual differences. But for the moment, I think one of the reasons that women who are able to ascend the corporate ladder are doing so is because they're much better conflict managers than some of the men that they're climbing over.
In reading your book, The Good Fight, I was interested in kind of the history of this idea for you, and it drew back to those group projects early in elementary school. And the question came up in my mind. I can't think of anyone who has ever said that they've worked in a group project and they were the one that shirked their duties. Everyone always seems to think they pulled an unequal amount of weight. Why is that?
So there are lots of cognitive biases we have to try and keep us healthy. So we know that psychologically healthy people are a little bit delusional. That just helps us feel good about ourselves. We know that the most realistic people are actually depressed people, which is kind of sad, but it tells us that a little bit of delusional view of ourselves is good for us. It's healthy. So that's what we're seeing for the most part. So we have the fundamental attribution error where when we do something wrong, we attribute that to the situation. Well, I had a lot of other priorities. I didn't drop the ball. I just was focusing on other things, right? So we attribute our own failure to the situation, and we tend to attribute someone else's failure to their character or their traits. So we're like, that guy's just a loser. So he's a loser, and I just had many priorities. So that fundamental attribution error makes us misremember, misattribute who's taking what share of the load in a group project. And we need to really watch that and understand, what are the other possibilities? What are the other possibilities for what I was up to? Like maybe I really was slacking off, and what was that about? And also the other possibilities for what was going on for our teammates that, maybe they're not a slacker, maybe they're not dumb, maybe they had many priorities going on. So there's a lot of cognitive biases that cause us to be a little easier on ourselves and a bit hard on everybody else.
Is it self-preservation? Is it this idea that we're going to be in trouble if we are reflective of our own shortcomings?
Yeah, a little bit. Like we got to keep going, right? There's all sorts of biases built into humans. Like, you can't remember childbirth afterwards, or we would not have a population. So there's all sorts of delusions that are that work for us, that are good coping strategies. So the same is true of if we every time we failed, we let that weigh on us and we let it really drag us down. That's not so good for being effective in the future. So it's good to kind of let that stuff roll off your back. It's just not great if you do that with teammates in a way that's really going to have you seen as unreliable or not trustworthy. Then it's got a bit of a cost. So we have to remember we're social creatures. So it's not all about the conversations we have with ourselves. It's partly about how we're perceived and how we fit in with the group as well.
Are there cultures or areas or certain industries where you see that they generally do conflict better at work or in teams?
Yeah, so there's different cultures. So the one that is sort of most famous world over for their conflict is the Israeli culture. So they are so direct and matter of fact when they talk about things that we would be, so worried about having these conversations. So they're very, very direct about it. They kind of go at it. They also have, if you remember World War Z and the story of, the Israeli culture around the ninth man needs to disagree, even if they don't, in order to protect and make sure there's that mechanism for avoiding groupthink. So there's some positive cultures in the Israeli culture for sure. The German culture, similarly, matter of fact and those sorts of things. But those cultures still have downsides. In terms of organizational cultures, Amazon is really the most impressive I've ever seen about having conflict be baked into the culture. So they have a leadership principle around disagree and commit. And it is just fundamental in their organization. People understand they have an obligation to disagree. It's not permission. It's not if you feel like it. It's we need you putting tension on our decisions and in our thinking. That's what you sign up for when you sign up to work at Amazon. But they have the productive version of it, which is, and then once the decision is made, you 100% commit to making the implementation successful. So there's a whole corporate culture that's really built around healthy conflict. So we have some national cultures. And then, of course, we have national cultures. Like I'm talking to you from Toronto. I'm Canadian. We have an entire national culture that sucks at conflict. We have, our entire brand is about being nice. And of course, nice is what we put on the posters. Passive aggressive is what we're actually like in the boardroom. So, Minnesotans are right there with us, right? With Minnesota Nice. So there are national cultures. There are kind of local and regional cultures. There are organizational cultures that are either better or worse at using conflict as the positive, constructive tool that it really can be.
So what do leaders understand when they, like Amazon, that you have an obligation to disagree? What do those leaders understand that seemingly a lot of the corporate world and just us in general do not understand or do not abide by?
Yeah, they understand that that conflict is inevitable in business. Just with the very fact that there are never enough resources to fuel our ambitions. That's sort of, to me, the simplest case for conflict in organizations. There will never be enough resources to fuel our ambitions. So we are always making trade-offs. So they understand that. They understand that they want to actually get to the other side of the conflict. That's where the productive form of conflict comes, is that it's something we go through and get to the other side of. And they understand that conflict debt, that is the pile up of issues we haven't resolved, is much more dangerous than the conflict itself. So they've kind of internalized that. They understand that the tension and the productive conflict is necessary for innovation. They know it's necessary for growth. They understand that it's important to learning and trust and positive dynamics among a team. And they know that without productive conflict, there is no risk assessment and risk mitigation. So they really understand holistically how important productive conflict is to their organizations. They get that.
What is it? How do you define productive conflict, and what makes it different than people just narcissistically fighting for their own ideas?
Yeah. And it's, of course, the productive part. So it's a tension between opposing forces that gets resolved in a way that allows you to move forward better than you were beforehand. So unproductive conflict, and the two terms I tend to use when we're defining the difference, productive conflict is about tension. So tension is something that kind of stretches us, allows us to take scarce finite resources and make them go farther. It's a stretch, a pull. So we think about tension with growth and all those sorts of things. And it doesn't feel great in the moment when someone's putting tension on you. Like, are you sure? You're like, no. Like, it doesn't feel great, but that's productive. The unproductive form of conflict is friction. So friction doesn't cause us to grow. Friction wears us down and burns us out. And the last thing you want in your engine is friction, right? So friction comes in the form of things that do make us question ourselves, doubt ourselves, lose our mojo or self-confidence, lose trust, because we know that trust allows teams to have better performance, better innovation. There's a lot of research about the value of trust. Unproductive conflict erodes that trust and creates the friction that gets in the way. So I've come to kind of either talking about productive conflict or switching to the terms more tension, less friction.
And you mentioned conflict debt earlier, and the buildup of those moments where we don't lean into conflict, if that's the right phrase. What happens as that debt balloons?
Ooh, bad things, bad things. So on the one hand, nothing happens, right? Because we don't make the call, we don't move forward, we don't create the new product, we don't land the new customer. So in one sense, when we're in conflict debt, nothing happens. But all sorts of collateral damage is done. So one of the most common forms of conflict debt is a failure of leaders to prioritize. And prioritization is one of the conflicts that people really hate dealing with. Why would I have to pick one thing or another? If I pick one thing over another, somebody's going to be mad at me. We're not going to win. We have to do everything if we're going to beat the competition. So their leaders will give you a litany of reasons why prioritization is just not possible. So when we fail to prioritize, when we get into conflict debt around failing to prioritize, the collateral damage is, well, first of all, we dilute our resources, our money, our time, our technologies, and of course, our people and our energy over very many things. So we reduce the return on investment in things that we're doing. When we get into conflict debt, we have collateral damage of mistrust, of people feeling this overwhelming burden of stress. So there are huge costs. And one of the problems is that when you get into a little bit of conflict debt with somebody, if we go back to those cognitive biases happening in our brains all the time, then the next email you get from them, you don't just read it with the regular narrator that reads your emails. I don't know what narrator reads your emails, Michael, but I have a whole set of narrators. But instead of reading the next email that person sends with my neutral movie trailer narrator, I read it with my Darth Vader narrator, which is like, I'm hearing that person's voice as a bit of a villain as I'm reading their email. Well, and now they're saying something nasty to me. Now, to be fair, if Princess Leia had read that email to me, I would have thought it was a call for help. But no, I just read it now as some kind of nasty missive about something. So then that little conflict debt, now because I've read the email differently, and then the next time I interact with them, I have my arms folded and my brow furrowed, and I'm just a little cranky pants. Well, then they hear the cranky pants, and so they return in kind, and you can hear what's happening, right? We get into this downward spiral. So people will often say to me, but Liane, shouldn't you pick your battles? And I'm like, well, if you can honestly choose not to be upset by that issue, if you can cast it aside and promise me you're going to read the next email, not with Darth Vader narrator, then yes. But if you're just saying, I don't have the energy to have that conflict, I don't have the guts to have that conflict, I don't have a case to make in that conflict, so I'm not going to broach it, then no, that's a terrible idea, because then you get the seed of resentment. And as Nelson Mandela said, resentment is swallowing poison, hoping the other person will die. And that's what we need to avoid in teams. So conflict debt is a huge problem. And it starts with a very, very small problem that then escalates and gets into a pretty nasty spot.
Then the question becomes, how in the world does a team with mountains of conflict debt poured across the organization even begin to come up to the surface?
Yeah. So I'll give you my candid answer from experience, which is very rarely does it ever happen without at least one person leaving the team.
Mm-hmm.
And that's unfortunate, but the way we're animals, and at some level, animals learn aversions to things from their experience. And if people have been burned too many times by someone, there are just legitimate reasons why some people will just never trust again. And if you're at the point where people will never trust again, then you're not going to get to the other side of the problem. So in most of the teams where we're dealing with fairly significant conflict debt, the true answer is that usually at least one person leaves. It doesn't usually have to be a lot more than that. There's something that just says, pulling that one person out changes the dynamic just enough that everybody goes, oh, this is serious. So it changes people's mindset about it. It just creates a little bit of space and a little bit of oxygen to jockey around. Well, maybe my behavior wasn't the best, and there's just a little bit of room for movement. It's like those kids' games with the squares. You need to have the one square not there so you can move the other squares all around. Once you have one square not there, there's not a log jam anymore. Now we've got a little bit of wiggle room. And then where I normally start is not with the conflict at all. I normally appeal to not a higher power, but I normally appeal to a bigger issue, which is to start the team with the question, what are we here to do? What is the organization counting on us to do? What are our customers counting on us to do? What's our purpose on the planet? And those questions that are both longer time horizon and more external bring you away from that evaluation and judgment and the mire of the trust issues. I never start with the trust issues. I go to these bigger questions. What have we got to accomplish? What are people counting on us for? And we create the picture of what could and should be for the team. So always using those words. What could we be focused on? What should we be? And could and should get us out far enough that we don't feel judged as people. And then you can start to address, okay, if that's what we need to do for our organization, what would we have to do to make that happen? What would we have to do more of? What would we have to do less of? And we begin to picture a new reality, still without ever judging the current reality. And then we can talk about, okay, how would we have to behave to get there? What different processes, what different conversations, what different behaviors? And slowly you build enough trust to then talk about, all right, so when we have to have this hard conversation that's certainly going to come up, what are going to be our ground rules? How are we going to do that? How are we going to broach it? What are we not going to do? So that's when I get a team that's really deep in. I start with, is there somebody that needs to go? Can you tell right now that, we need the one square of degree of freedom to be able to move this? I encourage the leader to deal with that first. Then a conversation about a higher calling. So our purpose as a team, and then focus on what that would take, what that would look like before we ever come back to saying, okay, what's one step we can take in that direction? That unlocks, because so much of what people are worried about is that they're going to get blamed in the first conversation, that people are going to point fingers at them. And I try and have a long first conversation where there's no blame at all. It's simply talking about, what do we all want to be for the future? And it's amazing how aligned people tend to be around the answers to those questions. That alignment creates a little bit of traction that allows you to then start to get to some of the behavioral stuff. So that's how I manage it. And I would encourage you, if you're stuck with a team that's really in conflict up to your eyeballs, that's how I would broach it as well.
Liane, why is this so important to you that you've made it your life's work?
Because I suck at conflict. It's my great gap, right? I really don't like conflict in any way, shape, or form. And I think at some point I realized if I wanted to be successful, so I was a manager very early in my career and made a lot of mistakes trying to keep everyone happy. I am a pleaser for sure and have gotten into trouble trying to please people. And so many situations where I realized, and I kind of had the realization on behalf of my clients at the same time as I had it for myself, and maybe even a little sooner for my clients as I was helping them see that the reason they were in these intractable situations was because it was like the kids were going on a bear hunt song, right? We can't go over it. We can't go under it. We got to go through it. And as I was telling them that, I was, leaving these sessions being like, Liane, and did you want to listen to yourself? Anything you've been trying to go over and under, but not through? And, started to realize that, I should listen to myself. And so it just became, I think really in many ways, first for my clients, and then having the realization this had been what was causing me challenges in my own marriage, in my own work and career. So it just became, this is the one thing that I seem to be able to really help people with. When they listen to me talk about conflict, they seem to go, oh, okay, I can do that. And, when you find the thing that when you talk about it, people can see things in a new light, it's like, well, that's probably your thing. So conflict is my thing.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting thing to be known for, I guess.
I know. It's true, but you got to just embrace it, right?
Sure.
You got to embrace it.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I'm glad you have. It's super interesting. You mentioned that being a pleaser got you into trouble. And I feel like there are some instances there. Can you recount or recall an instance where that happened?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was really early on as a manager, I'm trying to please my boss and trying to say that, of course, my team can do that and we can do everything. And the other team's dropping the ball. Sure, you can count on it, right? And I'm trying to say everything to her that makes me feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to. And then I'm looking at my team who have these giant eyeballs looking at me like, you said we could do what? And trying to be the cool boss, like the coolest boss, that all my people love me and rate me high on the survey. and just at some point realize, Liane, you can't be both those things. It's completely disingenuous. And you're going to have to figure out what's the right situation. What is a viable amount of work? What's doable? You're going to have a better conversation with your boss about realistic expectations. You're going to have a better conversation with your team and understand that sometimes you're going to ask of them things that they don't love, but over the long run, if you take the high road, they'll probably really respect you as a boss. And so, it was really, I was probably 27, 28 when I was figuring out that, trying to make everyone happy really quickly makes nobody happy, most importantly, me.
What about in those instances where, as you just described, we can't get rid of the member of the team? And by that, I mean outside of the business world, family. Yep. Obviously we can
never
friends,
happens.
Right? especially not now during
not
now.
The
States.
Now. It's definitely not going to be a problem at Thanksgiving,
no,
right? Definitely not.
No, everybody's looking forward to those conversations, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Something you posted, and I even just posted about it today and quoted you on LinkedIn and Twitter and Instagram and all over the place, is facts don't win arguments.
Facts don't solve fights.
Facts don't solve fights. Exactly.
Solve fights.
What happens in those instances, like I just said, or just asked, where we can't get rid of our mom, our sister, our uncle? What goes on there?
Yeah. It's such a hard question that I've been thinking so much about recently. Watching people in my family or people I care about posting things on Facebook that I have this big, deep exhale. and, it's really challenging for me because if you want to hold yourself accountable for something, write a book about it and send it out into the world. Then people are like, I thought you were so good at this conflict thing, right? Didn't you write the book on conflict? So,
Literally.
there's this tremendous accountability to take the high road. So I've just kind of made a deal with myself that I'm going to try and get through 2020 with this concept that I can love people whose behavior I don't like or agree with. So that's kind of a starting point. I come hard with curiosity. So, wow, what happened to them that they feel that kind of anger? One of my friends posted a bumper sticker recently that was a US political bumper sticker, and it was just vile. It was hate and vitriol and awful. I think it was the F word. I don't know if you swear on this podcast, but F your feelings. Or I don't care about your effing feelings or something like that. And so I just said, well, let's just spend a moment thinking about what's been true in this person's life that they feel that way. Because, people who have felt heard, felt understood, felt unconditionally loved don't say things like that.
Right.
So something's wrong, something's injured, something's broken. So how can I react to things? And it's never going to be my first reaction. My first reaction is always going to be, oh, like what a jerk. But I try and keep those reactions inside my head and not ever speak them or type them. And to have curiosity be the reaction that comes out. And so that's what I did on my friend's wall. I just said, what do you think has been their reality, that's how they feel? And how do we start to have those conversations and make those people feel like we want to hear those things constructively? And so with family members, there's been, so the Black Lives Matter has been the one that for me has been the most obvious. And you go through all the crazy uncles who've posted the all lives matter and police lives matter, blue lives matter, right? And you take a deep breath and you make an effort. So I've decided to, okay, what do you mean when you say that? And, to listen to them and listen to what they are fearing. And, they're fearing reverse discrimination. And so, talking to them a little bit about, what makes you worry about that? Or are you worried about that for your sons? Are you worried that your white sons are not going to have job opportunity or spots in college? Or because if that's what you're worried about, that's real and that's legitimate. And I want to talk to you about that. And then and so the technique I teach people, I call validation. And so in that moment, when you want to tell them how wrong they are and spout reasons why they're wrong, whether it's about why face masks work or whatever it is that you want to tell them about why it's so wrong.
There's a lot of different issues right now.
Yeah, many of those. So again, whatever first reaction is going to be your first reaction in your head, I can't control that, nor can you. So just make sure you keep your mouth zipped shut while that rushes through. Then the first thing out of your mouth is, okay, so for you, all lives matter, or it's important to say that all lives matter. So just say something that makes them feel heard and makes them feel understood. Then step 2, curiosity. What does that mean to you? What do you fear will happen if we say Black Lives Matter too many times? How do you imagine this playing out? In what way, who do you think is injured by using the phrase Black Lives Matter? So asking questions, really getting to, so when I said facts don't solve fights, it's because if you're having a fight, it's because there's something emotional and something values-based. Usually these things get to something about fairness or rights or those sorts of things. So they're very deep. So when you ask these questions, you get that out. You kind of hear about it. Once you've done that, the third thing to do is to speak their truth. So for you, this is really about making sure that everybody has opportunity. That okay, yeah, I hear you. Here's how I'm thinking about it. And so Black Lives Matter, there's been some really, really great, examples of like little stories that just help you understand, like, if you dish out the dinner and you dish out dinner on everybody's plate except one person, and he says, I deserve dinner, and you say everybody deserves dinner. It's like, well, yes, but everybody else has dinner and I don't. So those little examples that have been useful for then sharing your truth. And if you've spent the time to validate what they've said, to really understand what's underneath that for them, where they're hurting, where they're worried, what their anxieties are, what they're imagining, and you've spoken their truth out of your mouth before you worry about your truth, you've usually earned the right to then say, here's how I'm thinking about it, or here's where I'm choosing to say Black Lives Matter instead of saying all lives matter. So that's kind of the deal I've made with myself. So first of all, understand that I can love somebody and not like their behavior, and members of my family I'm going to love and not like their behavior. And that's okay. That doesn't make me a bad person. Secondly, I'm going to take the high road when I can, and put in a little bit of effort to do this validation technique, so that I'm going to make sure that they feel heard, because most of the time we're just belittling people. So one of the articles that I posted recently on my private Facebook was about how if you look at the rise of dictators and various authoritarian governments in many, many, many times throughout history, they all follow a period of deep humiliation of a people. So when we shame people, when we humiliate them, as is going on in the US right now, where I think we've taken a whole class of people and said we called them a basket of deplorables, right? We've been horrible. When we humiliate people, the reaction gets stronger. And so I've just committed for myself to say, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to humiliate anybody. I'm going to try and hear them. I'm going to try and understand them. And I'm going to take the high road of sharing another way of thinking about it. But in the end, if, Uncle Woody doesn't get it, then I'm going to say, I love you, Uncle Woody. And I'm going to get up and probably go have some more pumpkin pie.
Always a good solution.
To everything, and extra whipped cream. If you've had to deal with an Uncle Woody, I'm telling you, go for the extra whipped cream.
I wish everyone could hear the last 5 minutes of what you just said. That is so eloquent. Like, bravo. That is amazing. The gap between the initial gut reaction and asking the question seems cavernous. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Why is it so hard to suppress the initial gut reaction and wait to then become curious, as you said?
Mm-hmm. But, neurobiology. So the gut reaction comes from, really far down in our brains. It comes habitually, unconsciously. It's just there. It took us our whole lifetime to build up those biases and prejudices and whatever they are. And no matter if you're left or right or any of the above, you've got biases and prejudices, and those are baked in and they're fast. To get to the let me make space to empathize and see it differently. Now we got to go up to the prefrontal cortex and we got to fire her up because we're not using her all the time. I'm like imagining me pulling my 2-stroke engine, like, come on, baby, you can do it. Especially at a family holiday. Like, oh, don't make me use my prefrontal cortex on a holiday. But that's why, right? We're firing up this expensive machine that it even takes more blood and glucose in our blood to fuel that sucker. She needs premium fuel. So yeah, that's literally our biology. The difference between using this sort of habitual system that can just, she can dish stuff out. Oh baby, she fast, versus kicking into this more thoughtful mode that can generate options, weigh the value of options, give us different ways of framing a sentence to reduce the likelihood that it's going to get a fork thrown at us. yeah, that's just a more cumbersome brain process. And so, I've been practicing it for a long time. I actually have created a tool I call 100 productive conflict questions. And I just send it to people to say, here's 100. I've cheated for you. Just and people one of the interesting questions that's come up a lot lately is, should we have difficult conversations over video calls during COVID and during work from home? And my answer is, heck yeah, you can have cheat sheets. It's way better. And so here, print out the 100 questions and just look down, pick one you like, and there you go. But, you need to start to have a few default ones. The best default one, if you're planning for a family dinner, is just say more. If you got nothing else, if you're still firing it up, still pulling the crank, just throw in a good say more. That'll buy you some time. I really like that one. I do that one a lot. I have 2 teenage daughters, so say more works well with them. But just having 3 or 4 generic ones that come out of your mouth really easily while you're firing her up are really helpful. So I will often go to things like, what do you think we need to solve for? Or where do we go from here? Or those kinds of things. Just at least don't allow the out of your mouth.
Yeah.
Just give you enough time to come up with a better question. So, but don't be surprised and don't judge yourself for the fact that it's not what comes naturally. It's how you're wired, literally.
Is that what you're referring to when you're saying building a conflict habit of high frequency and low, how do you put it? Low
impact.
Impact, yes. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. So when we pile up conflict debt, the reason so many of us don't like conflict is that the conflicts we're having, we've let go on for months. And when it finally comes out, and I write about this in the book. When in the last chapter, I talk about try this from home. And I talk about how my husband and I had to go to therapy because we were so terrible at conflict. By the time we finally got to the psychologist's office, we're like, and remember in 1995 when you, it was frightening. So of course, it's going to be a really aversive conversation when you stored up. And I love the term baggage, right? We've all got baggage. Well, if your baggage is like Kim Kardashian's, you got 6 Louis Vuitton trunks filled with stories from, ways that you've been wronged for years. Well, of course, it's going to be something aversive. If you have a conversation at your WebEx this morning and it doesn't sit right, and so this afternoon you say, hey, can I just touch base with you? I'd love to just talk through that WebEx. Something isn't sitting right with me, and I just want to clarify or just want to get back on the same page. It's such a tiny thing that it's so much less likely to be a blowout. So if we can have conflict, tiny little conflicts. So the other story I tell that people find helpful on this is many years ago, near where I live in Toronto, we got a fancy new toll highway, one of the ones that takes a picture of your license plate and then sends you the bill. So I decided I was going to try it, and I drove on the highway. It was fantastic. There's nobody on there. Went so fast. It was amazing. And then I got a bill in the mail, and a bill for the $7 or whatever in the mail. But it was a bill, and I had to find a check, and I had to find a stamp, and I had to find a post box, and all these things were, not things I had used often. And so I kind of procrastinated it. And I think I wrote the check and put it somewhere till I could go find a stamp or buy a stamp. And anyway, the long story short, a year and a half later, I paid $132 to a collection agency. And that's what I talk about is exactly the same with our conflict, right? If we just paid the $7 when the issue first came up, it would have been fine. But we don't pay the $7. We pay the interest, we pay the penalties, we have the sleepless nights, we have the collateral damage on other projects and how we read our emails. So that's a big problem.
I want to go back to something that you said and kind of touched on, and it's something that I've read in some of your work as well, is you say there's something beneath the facts in an argument. Why don't facts work in an argument?
Yeah, if you're in an argument, it's almost never about facts, because if it was just a dispute about facts, you would never even label it an argument. It'd be like, yeah, we're problem solving, or we're making a decision. Yeah. You would have a different label for it. Once it's in a fight, the reason we would call it or label it a fight or an argument or conflict is because we're starting to see the emotional tenor change. So it's getting more upsetting, it's getting more frustrating, it's getting more hostile, those sorts of things. And once we've got emotional engagement, emotions aren't very helpful in diagnosing where a fight is coming from, but they're really helpful symptoms in understanding that, oh, something's going wrong here. So the metaphor I use for that is I had bursitis in my shoulder for quite a long time. And every time I would throw my arms up in the air when I was giving a keynote speech, which I did far more often than I should have, given I had bursitis in my shoulder, I get this shriek of pain down my side. And that pain was extremely useful because it said, you're injuring yourself again. And it just taught me that, so pain is very similar to when we see emotions in a fight. So pain and emotions, neither of them is good to have over the long haul. But in the short term, they're really helpful because it's a great symptom that there's an injury going on there. And just like pain, sometimes where we feel pain, I had a really good friend who they thought she had back problems. It took them 2 years to diagnose an ulcer that was showing up as back pain. So it's a good symptom, but it's not very diagnostic. So we have to do the work of finding out, okay, I'm seeing the emotions, I'm seeing the pain, I know there's an injury. We got to get one layer beneath that. And usually that's about values. So when I talked about the Black Lives Matter example, a lot of that comes back to different definitions and values about fairness. What is fairness? And, is fairness treating everyone equally? Is consistency your definition of fairness? Or is equity your definition of fairness, and understanding that treating some people differently because they're in a different situation is more fair? Well, when we get to the bottom of that, it leads to some very different ideas about what to do with, if we have had 400 years of systemic anti-Black racism, what do we do about it? Well, if people believe that you're supposed to treat everyone the same, then, it's very different than if people believe fairness is about shifting what you do and leveling the playing field, and sometimes doing something unfair to one person because then it's more fair to the other. Like, is fairness a dynamic concept? And when you understand that, there's values underneath this emotion. When we get to some of the stuff going on in our society right now, so much of the value is just the basic human need for predictability and familiarity. Just, we are wired to be more comfortable around people who look like us, who sound like us, who worship like us, who, et cetera, et cetera. And that's being violated in some cases by change in the world. And so if we can have more empathy, if we can understand, if we can talk about, if we can see more ways that we're similar than ways that we're different. Of course, what's interesting is that when we have communities where humans of all different stripes live together more closely, racism goes down, not up. Familiarity breeds liking in humans. And usually for the folks who are worried about it, it's more of a fear of the unknown as opposed to a fear of something real. But invalidating that fear is not going to make their fear go away. It's going to make them more anxious about it. The more you tell them not to worry about that, the more they're going to mistrust you. And they won't have that conversation with you anymore. So how do we get to the values? How do we understand? And, I'm talking about around the dinner table, but, in your organization, exactly the same thing. So I remember helping an executive team make a really tough call about whether they were going to do a downsizing or not. It was a really, really hard decision. But when we could finally understand that the people around the table were making decisions based on different things, and the general manager of the business unit was he had such a strong value of performance and obligation, and he just felt it was his duty to get his business back into the black and making a profit again. And the CEO had such a strong value of just mojo and culture and all those sorts of things. And he was willing to ride with a unprofitable business for a while because he was so afraid of wrecking the mojo. Well, once you could say that out loud, like once the GM could say, I feel like I'm failing every single month, I see that number in the red. I feel like I'm failing. I'm not living up to my obligation to the shareholders. And he could say that out loud. And the CEO could say, I just feel so nervous about killing the mojo of this company and saying anything that's going to, make people mistrust their relationship with us. Once everybody said those values out loud, it was amazing how easy it was to make the decision. But something invalidating that there was no right or wrong value. We just all needed to actually say them out loud. Then we could make the decision. And what they ended up deciding was the business really needed to make the cut, but how we did it. And it turned out there were ways to redeploy most of the people. There were a whole bunch of things that they could do in how they implemented the decision that allowed everybody to feel like they had lived up to their values. So, facts don't solve fights for sure. But when we can see emotion or hear emotion or pick up emotion as the symptom that there's an injury, and then really get to the diagnostic level of some big open-ended questions that help us understand how are you thinking about this here? What picture are you painting in your head? What's the story you're telling yourself? What are you most worried might happen? Those kinds of big questions that allow people to project their values onto something. And then once we can, I'm hearing for you, you're worried about how downsizing might, really hurt the morale in the company in a way that we can't recover from. If you can speak someone else's truth, validate their truth, it's amazing how fast you get back to problem solving as allies instead of, arguing as adversaries. So that's what I mean when I say facts don't solve fights. And, first spot the emotion, the pain, the symptom, and then get down to the values. And that's the level at which you're going to actually solve anything.
Are you at all concerned about this time right now and how much of our interactions are being done over social media, over Slack, over email, over text message, where we don't get a chance to see how that human interacts, hear the tone of someone's voice? Is that at all concerning to you right now?
All day, every day.
Mm-hmm.
All day, every day. I'm nervous. I really notice in myself that because I know the current situation is not set up for productive conflict. It is really well set up for very divisive, destructive conflict. I'm so worried about how much humiliation is happening on both sides.
Yeah.
And, people who have been humiliated are dangerous. I think legitimately people who've been humiliated are dangerous. And so to all of my friends, and I've made myself unpopular by kind of getting on their Facebook pages and saying, hey, I'm totally cool with everybody talking about policies, everybody talking about decisions, everybody talking about, those sorts of things. Yes, absolutely. More of it. I am not cool with humiliating people. Shaming them, making fun of them, making anyone seem less valid than any other person. If people believe something that you just completely cannot understand, you do the work. Ask some questions, figure it out. How can I empathize? Because if you can't stay in curiosity, if you go straight to judgment, if you shame, if you humiliate, you will get a dangerous reaction. I think we're really, really in a precarious spot of having shamed so many people that there's no path back. And I think the history tells, I think it was a Thomas Friedman article was the one I was posting. History tells us that people who've been shamed and humiliated become very dangerous.
Liane, what's a question that you wish you were asked more?
What's a question that I wish I was asked more? I think one of the questions that I wish I was asked more was about our kids and our future? And how do we not pass on our conflict aversion to our children?
How do we do that?
I think we have to dig deep and really model something very different. So one of the things that we do so quickly now is we label everything as bullying. And we protect our children by jumping in front of the bullets in so many ways. And we think that that's protecting their self-esteem, but it's actually ensuring that they never build any self-esteem whatsoever. We are trying to be their out-of-body shield. And, an out-of-body shield means we need to be with them. You got to move to college with them. Like, I don't think you want to do that. Maybe you do, but
no.
So I think we have to start really early. So here's my first stupid example. When my kids were in their preschool, every week on Friday night, there would be this giant bag of quote unquote art that would come home. Often it was a piece of green construction paper with one line of pink paint through the middle where the teacher had written my child's name.
I know those well.
Right?
Yeah.
Wow, precious. And first of all, the fact that the school is saying to them, like, wow, isn't this all beautiful and valid and awesome? I'm like, okay, Mr. Rogers, we've gone too far. Hang on. Like, can the preschool actually start to teach them to actually judge their own work? What do you love? What do you not love? You know what? Let's not kill their dreams. Let's not impose our own standards of what's good and not. Let's teach them to be discriminating about their own work, right? I really like this one. This is the one I want to take home to my parents this week. Or if the schools can't do that, okay, it comes home and we have the conversation. And the first conversation is, okay, tell me about these. Wow, neat. Okay, which do you want to keep one? Is one of these worth keeping? Should we put this on our wall? And so my mom actually did us a huge favor. She bought us this wonderful thing that went on the wall, and it had 9 Velcro picture frames, plastic kind of picture frames. And so there were 9 spots, and you could just slide a portrait, an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper in. It was great because it was like, Kate, this is where we display our 2 children's art. And so you'd have the bag come home and you'd say, okay, are any of these worth taking out, any that are in the display? Should we, is it time to change them? And we would actually talk about what they loved and what was worthy and what they wanted to keep, not making them feel precious. Like every time they touch a paintbrush to a piece of paper, that it somehow needs to be kept forever. And so that's the start. And then you let them have feedback. You give them feedback, and it's real. And it's not always, you're so amazing. You're the youest you could ever be. And then we start talking to them when things go wrong on the playground about how, sometimes we say nasty things to one another, and that's really natural in relationships. And what do you think was going on for him today that he did that or said that? And we teach empathy, and we ask them, say, what do you think you could do? And what did you do? And what else might you do? And we just start to normalize conflict as a part of, and, if you have a fight with your spouse, okay, did you hear mom and dad fighting? Yeah, we do that sometimes because we really, it's hard decisions we have to make sometimes. And, we love each other very much. And, this is how we got to the other side of this, right? Like, we need to early teach people that conflict is a natural part of healthy relationships and a way of preventing unhealthy relationships. We have to learn to advocate for ourselves. And then we have the opportunity over time as they get older to build sort of age-specific conflict skills. And unfortunately, right now, I think we think every kid deserves the giant trophy and every kid gets a medal. So they get no real self-esteem. It's all false. We don't let them get feedback. We protect them from feedback. We go after teachers that have natural and appropriate consequences for their behavior. We label any discomfort as bullying. So we've done a lot to make sure that all of our hang-ups are getting passed on, and that's doing a real disservice to our children.
I love that. As a parent, I will immediately begin to execute on that. And high frequency, low impact, right? I mean, that's kind of the value again.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a great example of high frequency, low impact. Okay, let's make the first hard decision. Okay, what are we keeping? What are we not keeping? What's going? And it was so funny. I said this in a speech one time, and one of the people stood up, and she was so proud of herself because she's like, well, I take one out, and then I secretly in the night, throw the rest in the garbage. And I was like, I don't think you get the point. Like, oh, good, now you're raising a passive aggressive child.
Oh no,
no, we can actually tell them that. Sometimes, and, not every time did they do a great job. And that's okay. And we can say that. We can say, you spent 4 hours practicing for your spelling test last week, and you only spent about 30 minutes this week. Did it feel differently? Did you get a different outcome? We don't have to protect them. And if we do protect them, they're more vulnerable. They don't actually have self-esteem. We actually have to develop self-esteem by failing. That's how we learn what we can do and what we can't. And as long as we protect them from any legitimate, authentic feedback about what they're accomplishing, they're never going to have real self-esteem. So get yourself your college sweatshirt because you're moving in with them.
Fantastic stuff, Liane. Thank you so much for your time today. That is such a wonderful place to leave it. Where can people connect with you, follow along with you and your work? I think this has been absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, the best place is just lianedavey.com, which sounds really simple if I didn't have two really impossible to spell names. So I'm sure it's in the notes, but Liane. So it's like Diane, but with an L, and Davey. So lianedavey.com. And there are hundreds of free resources there about how to deal with your passive aggressive teammate, or, how to talk politics at the office, or any of those kinds of things. So that's the best place to find me, or on all of the regular LinkedIn, Twitter, if you want the behind the scenes view, Instagram, whatever. As you have to be these days, everywhere.
Beautiful. Love it. Thank you so much for your time. This is fabulous, and best wishes to you. All right.
My huge pleasure. Thanks so much, Michael.
Thank you. Many thanks to Liane for sharing her story on the show today. Please do me and Liane a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might also find some value in listening to today's conversation. Got a few thoughts on this. My thoughts on this episode and everything that Liane said. Stop arguing to win, and instead engage in healthy, frequent conflict to learn. The science is proven, guys. If we've ever argued for or against a certain position or idea, it is nearly impossible to change our minds. And the only way to do it is through empathy, understanding new points of view that we hadn't previously considered. So take that into your next team meeting, your next dinner with your family, your next conversation with your conflict avoidant teenager. I don't know. But don't avoid conflict. Seek it out, but seek it out to learn. Share this episode with your network. Help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with amazing guests like Dr. Liane Davey that I have on this show each and every week, be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Subscribing also helps the show gain more reach, so it's much appreciated. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com or go to thefollowupquestion.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.